You're about to step with me across the centuries, not to watch history from a distance, but to feel the raw texture of a world that operated on rules utterly foreign to our own tonight. We're peeling back time to understand the medieval mind and its unusual approach to justice, a worldview shaped not by strict legal codes, but by sacred tradition, divine authority, and solutions that often bordered on the unbelievable. For medieval people, law wasn't a tidy set of instructions. It was a living force, a mirror of morality, order, and what they believed was absolute truth. So set aside your modern expectations, because we're about to enter the strange and unsettling world of medieval justice, starting with one of its most bizarre features: putting animals on trial. Yes, animals. Picture this clearly: a dim, drafty courtroom, shadows stretching along stone walls, the smell of damp straw mixed with tension, and a crowd whispering as the judge takes his seat. But the accused standing before him is not a man, it's an animal. For hundreds of years across medieval Europe, creatures could be formally tried the same way humans were, complete with prosecutors, defenders, witnesses, and even appeals. Consider the year 1386 in the French village of Peth. A pig was put on trial for killing an infant. The court found it guilty, and for the execution, the animal was dressed in human clothing, an eerie attempt to mark it with human responsibility. And this wasn't some isolated moment of madness. This was a serious part of a justice system that believed every living thing, human or animal, was bound to a divine moral order. Break that order, and the entire balance of the world demanded correction. But even that isn't the end of it. Medieval courts didn't stop at pigs harming children or bulls goring farmers. They summoned swarms of insects, condemned rats, and expected obedience from every creature under the sky. And the strangest part, these animal defendants often received surprisingly passionate legal defense. In 1750, a French court tried a female donkey for bestiality alongside the man who abused her. Her lawyer argued she had been forced into the act, and unbelievably, the court agreed. She was declared innocent, her good character vouched for by neighbors, while the man was sentenced to death. And the medieval imagination didn't stop with living beings. Even objects could be placed on trial. A sword that caused a death could be treated almost like a criminal, examined, judged, and even banished from the realm. In this world, everything had moral weight, and nothing escaped the reach of justice. Or consider a heavy church bell, its resonant clang, usually a comfort, now accused of summoning violent storms, and put on trial for its role in the destruction. Even ancient trees, whose sturdy branches offered shade for generations, could be prosecuted if they fell and tragically killed a passerby, subsequently sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reveal a worldview where the lines between the living and inert, the moral and amoral, were far more fluid than anything we comprehend today. Every single element of creation was perceived as part of an intricate moral tapestry, and when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in, often in startling ways, to weave it back together. Then there's the sheer drama of trial by ordeal, an almost theatrical test designed to unveil truth through divine intervention. You're standing in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with tension, the only sounds the rustle of robes and hushed prayers. The core belief was chillingly simple. God would never allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, thus rendering them a supernatural lie detector. One infamous method was the trial by hot iron. Can you imagine the sheer terror? you'd be forced to carry a searing, red-hot piece of iron for 9 agonizing paces, its heat radiating, the smell of burning flesh perhaps filling the air. Your hand would then be bandaged, and after 3 long, silent days, examined. A clean, healing wound meant innocence. Infection or poor healing, however, sealed your fate as guilty. Another common ordeal, equally brutal in its logic, was the trial by cold water. Here, you'd be bound and thrown into a body of water, frigid lake, a murky pond, the icy grip instantly shocking your breath away. If you floated, the pure water was believed to be rejecting you, marking you as guilty. If you sank and drowned, you were posthumously declared innocent. Isn't that just like history, presenting us with such a profound, terrible irony? Your only path to proving innocence, to having your name cleared, lay through a watery death. Talk about a significant design flaw in the justice system, wouldn't you agree? But for sheer spectacle and raw human drama, perhaps nothing matched the trial by combat. Picture the roaring crowd, the sun glinting off steel, the dust rising from the arena as 2 figures clash, their lives and honor at stake. Disputes weren't always settled in quiet chambers. Sometimes they unfolded through physical battle, either between the actual disputants or by hired champions fighting on their behalf. The unwavering belief that God would actively intervene, guiding the righteous party to victory. Interestingly, this isn't just a tale of men in armor. Women, clergy, and even the elderly could demand trial by combat, though they typically, and quite wisely, employed a muscular champion rather than entering the fray themselves. The medieval landscape also held some truly peculiar legal statuses for various professions, the executioner being a prime example. While their grim services were absolutely indispensable for the functioning of justice, they were simultaneously viewed with a deeply ingrained ritual uncleanliness. In many German states, for instance, you, as an executioner, would be forced to live beyond the city walls, an outcast, only permitted to enter town when your somber duties called. You couldn't even touch food in the marketplace. Your mere touch was thought to contaminate the goods, leaving a quiet ripple of discomfort wherever you walked. It was a life of isolation, suspicion, and stark necessity. Yet, in a bizarre twist of fate, these same executioners often supplemented their meager income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their intimate, if morbid, knowledge of anatomy, gained through their primary profession, made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. Imagine the paradox. The very hands that might take a life in the morning could be saving one by afternoon, mending bones or stitching wounds in the flickering light of their isolated home. The medieval treatment of debt, too, brought forth some strikingly inventive and often humiliating solutions. In parts of medieval France, if you, as a debtor, couldn't pay, you might find yourself sitting naked in the bustling town square, crying out your shame to every passerby. The raw vulnerability, the cold stones beneath you, the murmur and gaze of the crowd. It was a public humiliation designed both as a stark punishment and a desperate plea for charitable contributions. And then, there's the almost surreal concept of debt inheritance that emerged in some regions. Imagine living in certain parts of medieval Germany where unpaid debts could be passed down to your children. But here's the unsettling catch: only if they had been present when the debt was originally incurred. This chilling clause led to ... Imagine a world where the very concept of childhood was viewed through a different lens, where families might deliberately shield their youngest from the weighty burden of future debt by keeping them out of serious money talks. You see, the medieval mind, practical yet steeped in tradition, always found ways to protect its own, sometimes in ways that strike us as quite peculiar. This protective instinct, or perhaps a more pragmatic drive for order, also filtered down into the bustling markets and crowded trade routes, conjuring up a whole new set of rules that were, to put it mildly, rather extraordinary. Step with me now into the clamor of medieval London, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something undeniably unappetizing. Here, the consequences for defrauding the public, especially when it came to their daily bread, weren't just legal penalties. They were a spectacle of poetic justice that would make you wince. Picture this: a baker caught selling loaves that felt suspiciously light in your hand might find himself lashed to a wooden hurdle, dragged through cobblestone streets slick with mud, and refuse. The offending, undersized bread, a cruel irony, dangled from his neck for all to see, a silent, flour-dusted accusation. And what of the brewer, you ask, who dared to dilute your precious ale, turning a hearty brew into a watery disappointment? Their punishment, equally pointed, might be a forced, prolonged regimen of drinking only their own insipid concoction. Imagine that bitter taste, day after day, a constant reminder of their deceit. Beyond these public shames, the medieval understanding of property rights also gave rise to some truly fascinating legal concepts, like the enigmatic doctrine of treasure trove. You'd think finding something valuable in the earth would make it yours, right? But no, not quite. This peculiar law declared that if you unearthed a hidden cache of jewels or coins, something clearly buried with the intent of being retrieved, it automatically belonged to the crown. It was assumed, you see, that anyone burying such wealth intended to come back for it, making it essentially lost royal property. Yet, if that same glittering hoard was found merely lying asterisk above asterisk the ground, perhaps stumbled upon in a field or tucked under a loose stone, it then legally became the property of the lucky finder. This distinction, buried versus simply hidden, sparked no end of complex, dusty legal debates, didn't it? A head-scratcher, truly. Now, it's easy for us to dismiss these regulations as the whims of a less enlightened era, born of backward thinking or a primitive grasp of law. But that would be a mistake, wouldn't it? These weren't crude, simplistic rules. On the contrary, they represent remarkably sophisticated attempts to weave a strong social fabric, to maintain a precarious sense of order in a world profoundly different from the comfortable one we inhabit today. You see, medieval society wrestled with challenges that we can barely begin to comprehend, let alone live through ourselves. Imagine the pervasive fear, constant skirmishes, the sudden, devastating sweep of a plague, an economy perpetually teetering on the brink, and the gnawing, ever-present threat of starvation lurking just beyond your door. The air itself often carried the scent of apprehension. In such a fragile existence, laws couldn't merely be abstract statutes printed on parchment. They had to be living, breathing mechanisms, tools to painstakingly preserve that delicate, vital balance which held communities together, preventing total collapse. They were the very scaffolding of survival. The initial strangeness you might feel when contemplating these laws often melts away once you truly immerse yourself in their historical context. What appears utterly bizarre to us was, in fact, perfectly logical, even essential. To those who lived under the shadow of divine judgment, who understood that community harmony was not just a pleasant ideal, but an absolute prerequisite for their very survival. Justice, in this world, had to be undeniably visible, a tangible force that resonated deeply, not just in the minds, but in the hearts and daily lives of every single member of society. As you allow yourself to drift a little deeper into this world, the peculiar nature of these ancient statutes begins to reveal itself, not as isolated oddities, but as integral threads woven into an intricate tapestry of shared belief, time-honored tradition, and undeniable practical necessity. They whisper tales not only of legal systems, but of entirely distinct ways of perceiving the world, of understanding human nature, and indeed of defining our own place within the grand, sometimes bewildering scheme of creation. For now, let these fascinating echoes of medieval justice gently settle within your thoughts, a curious prelude to what lies ahead. Because, you see, the medieval world was also a realm of astonishing, almost brutal, contrasts when it came to the very sustenance of life itself, food. While you might conjure images of kings and nobles, their grand banquet halls echoing with laughter, laden tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, exotic spices, and course after opulent course, the stark reality, for the vast majority, was far grimmer. They lived perpetually on the precipice of hunger, their daily meals often reduced to little more than coarse, dark bread and a thin, watery gruel. This wasn't merely a difference in wealth. It was a visceral reflection of an entire social order built upon deep-seated inequality. For the common peasant, a scrap of meat was an unimaginable luxury, a rare indulgence to be savored. A family might lovingly tend to a pig, or a handful of scrawny chickens, their grunts and clucks a familiar sound in the small yard. But these creatures were simply too valuable to sacrifice for a meal. Instead, they were living assets, providing precious eggs, a trickle of milk, or the occasional offspring that could be bartered for much-needed coins. The truly rare occasions when meat graced a peasant's table usually coincided with sacred religious festivals, or, more grimly, when an animal had become too old or too sickly to serve any other purpose. Even then, every single morsel was utilized, from the dark, earthy organ meats to the rich, hearty blood puddings. You see, nothing, absolutely nothing, could be permitted to go to waste in a world where the certainty of your next meal was a cruel, elusive dream. The monumental challenge of preserving what little food existed was another daily battle. Without the blessing of refrigeration, medieval families had to tirelessly rely on arduous methods like heavy salting, smoky curing, sun-drying, and vigorous fermentation to keep their precious provisions from succumbing to the relentless march of decay. Salt itself, that crucial preserver, was often both prohibitively expensive and remarkably impure, frequently tainted with a gritty residue that could make preserved meats taste not just awful, but actively contribute to illness. Imagine the heavy, fishy temps of barrels packed solid with salt-cured fish, a far cry from any fresh catch you might know. Vegetables were submerged in sharp vinegar for pickling, or left to ferment into pungent sauerkraut, while fruits were painstakingly dried into leathery, chewy strips, their shriveled forms a promise of meager sustenance through the long, barren winter months. But perhaps the most insidious, stomach-churning problem of all was the pervasive, widespread adulteration of food. You can almost feel the desperation radiating from unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven to cut corners and maximize meager profits. That staple of life, bread, which felt so comforting in your hand, was routinely stretched with unspeakable fillers, sawdust, chalk, coarse ground, acorns, or even bone meal. These additions didn't just strip away vital nutrition, they could actively pose a grave danger to your health. Similarly, the ale and wine, meant to offer warmth and refreshment, were frequently watered down, leaving you with weak, unpalatable swill that offered little comfort or sustenance. Consider the plight of Agnes, a fictional but all-too-real alewife, whose story perfectly encapsulates these struggles. Picture her small, smoky establishment, the lingering smell of stale hops and desperation in the air. After her husband's untimely death, she found herself alone, battling soaring grain prices and a dwindling trickle of customers. Desperate to make her dwindling stores last, to simply put food on her children's table, she began, hesitantly at first, to water down her brew. For a short time, her deception went unnoticed amidst the din of the tavern, but the word soon spread, whispered rumor about weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal patrons, their coin jingling elsewhere, began to seek out other, more honest establishments, and Agnes's hard-won reputation withered and died. Inevitably, the doors of her humble business creaked shut for good, leaving her family plunged into an even deeper, more harrowing abyss of poverty. Of course, the authorities did try to intervene, attempting to regulate food quality with statutes like the Assize of Bread and Ale, laws that meticulously set standards for weight, price, and overall quality. Violators, like our unfortunate baker from before, faced not just fines, but the very public humiliation of the pillory, or even corporal punishment that left lingering aches. You might see a dishonest baker paraded through the very streets they served, their inferior loaves swinging like a morbid necklace, a stark warning to all who witnessed it. Yet, the enforcement of these laws was tragically inconsistent, often utterly ineffective, because the relentless economic pressures that drove people to such desperate acts of adulteration remained, crushing and unchanged, a constant, silent force in their lives. Beyond the quality, the sheer, mind-numbing lack of variety in the medieval diet was a suffering all its own. While you and I can casually pick up fruits and vegetables from every corner of the globe, year-round, medieval people were utterly, inescapably dependent on what could be coaxed from the local soil and what the current season graciously offered. For most of the year, a peasant's plate was a monotonous landscape of porridge, a thick, bland gruel made from barley, oats, or riper, haps grudgingly, accompanied by whatever root vegetables or greens they managed to cultivate. And you're out there, in your small patch of earth, the biting wind whipping around you as you tend to a few stubborn sprouts. Your family's survival, your very life, hinges on these small garden plots. You dig your fingers into the damp, cold soil, carefully coaxing what you can from it. Onions, leeks, and the ever-present cabbages are among the most resilient, clinging to life even in the harshest conditions. But you know, deep down, that these verdant greens, however precious, offer little in the way of true sustenance. They fill the stomach, yes, but the vital vitamins and minerals you crave, they remain elusive, a luxury you can only dream of. And then comes the dreaded hunger gap, a period that casts a long, chilling shadow over your existence. You feel it in your bones as late winter bleeds into early spring. By now, the bounty of last year's harvest, meticulously stored and rationed, has dwindled to a few meager handfuls, each grain a silent prayer. The new crops, meanwhile, are still tiny, fragile promises, far from ready to offer their gifts. This is when the gnawing ache in your stomach becomes a constant companion, when malnutrition takes its cruelest toll, and when, heartbreakingly, the death rates tragically spike. You've seen it, the listless eyes of children born during these lean months, their small bodies forever marked by stunted growth and immune systems too weak to truly fight. Isn't it a cruel irony? Now, shift your gaze, if you will, to another world entirely, one where scarcity takes on a very different meaning. Imagine the air thick with the fragrant ghost of cinnamon, the sharp sting of pepper, the sweet embrace of cloves, or the intoxicating warmth of nutmeg. These, my friend, were not just flavors in medieval Europe. They were whispers of distant lands, glimmers of immense wealth. Transported across vast, dangerous trade routes, their journey alone made them extraordinarily precious. A single pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could set you back the equivalent of 7 sturdy oxen. 7. Can you even fathom such a price? For ordinary folks like you and your neighbors, such exotic wonders were mere legends, unattainable dreams. But for the lords and ladies, the wealthy elite, spices weren't simply for flavoring a dish. Oh no, they were declarations, symbols of status, power, and prestige, displayed with as much pomp and pride as shimmering jewels or the finest embroidered silks. And nowhere was this stark, almost theatrical contrast between abundance and scarcity more glaringly obvious than at a royal feast. You might need a moment to adjust to the sheer extravagance of it all. These were not just meals. They were meticulously staged spectacles, designed to not only sat the appetites of the nobility, but to shout their wealth and power from the rooftops of the grand hall itself. You step into the great hall, the air thick with the roasting smells of exotic meats and the low murmur of anticipation. The tables, groaning under the weight of silver platters and ornate dishes, stretch as far as the eye can see. Roasted peacocks and swans, their iridescent feathers meticulously reattached after cooking, create stunning, almost surreal visual displays. Sugar sculptures, known as subtleties, depict fantastical scenes from mythology or intricate heraldic symbols, shimmering under the torchlight. Servants, moving with a practiced grace, parade dish after glorious dish through the hall, each presentation a mini-ceremony in itself. Yet, even amidst this magnificent spectacle, a hidden danger lurks, a silent predator that knew no social bounds. For all their opulence, for all their power, these medieval monarchs and nobles were shockingly vulnerable. Without even the slightest whisper of understanding about food safety, an elaborate feast could quickly turn into a fatal trap. You might be savoring a tender morsel, completely unaware of the peril it carried. Just look at King John of England in 1216, for instance. He had been journeying through the serene countryside, stopped at a quiet abbey, and indulged in what he believed was a perfectly harmless treat, some fresh peaches. Within days, the formidable king lay dead. Modern historians now largely agreeing it was severe food poisoning, a simple fruit, a seemingly innocent snack, and a powerful king brought low. It's a chilling reminder, isn't it, that in this era, every single meal, from the humblest crust to the most lavish banquet, held the potential for disaster. Now, let's peel back another layer, and you'll find that the pervasive, unsanitary conditions of medieval life only compounded these dietary dangers. Imagine sharing your single-room dwelling, not just with your family, but with your livestock. It sounds strange to modern ears, but those animals, the cows and pigs, huddled close, provided precious warmth during the long, bone-chilling winter months. A necessary trade-off, perhaps, but it meant animal waste. A constant buzz of insects and scurrying vermin were inescapable presences in your home. And where was your food prepared and consumed? In these very same bustling, contaminated spaces, you can see how hygiene was a losing battle. Step outside into the medieval city streets, and you'll find the situation is often even more alarming. Narrow, winding lanes, perpetually shrouded in shadow, are choked with a horrifying cocktail of garbage, human waste, and the refuse from countless trades and industries. Imagine the smells, the sticky filth underfoot, the constant drone of flies. The lack of any proper sewage systems meant that waste frequently seeped into and contaminated vital water sources, turning even a simple drink of water into a perilous gamble. Take London's Thames, for example. It served as both the city's primary water source, and its main sewer. Can you picture it? A river that was both lifeblood and cesspool. It's no wonder cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases swept through the population with terrifying regularity. Adding another intricate thread to this already complex tapestry of medieval food culture was the omnipresent influence of the Catholic Church. Its extensive fasting requirements were not suggestions, but obligations, deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. During Lent, that solemn 40-day period leading up to Easter, the faithful were expected to completely abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant a switch to fish, perhaps an indulgence in expensive alternatives. But for you, the ordinary peasant, it often meant simply going without. Your already meager diet stripped bare. And it didn't stop there. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays throughout the year were also designated as meatless days, further restricting an already precarious food supply. While the Church's intentions were undoubtedly spiritual, aimed at piety and sacrifice, the practical effect of these restrictions was often a devastating blow to those already teetering on the edge of malnutrition. You can see the dilemma, the heart-wrenching reality, in the fictional story of John and Matilda. With 3 hungry children to feed, and only a small, unyielding plot of land, they struggled to provide adequate nutrition even in the best of times. Then Lent arrived, demanding they give up the precious, small amounts of preserved meat and dairy, the very sources of crucial protein and calories that kept their family alive. As the solemn days wore on, you can almost hear their children's hollow cries, their small bodies growing weak and listless from the gnawing hunger. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith, his heart torn as he watched his family suffer. And Matilda, pragmatic and desperate, silently dreamed of the hearty stew she would finally make. A quiet rebellion of hope when the long, agonizing fast finally ended. Yet, let's be fair, not all of the Church's influence on food was a tale of hardship and deprivation. Far from it. In fact, many monasteries and abbeys, with their vast land holdings and meticulously organized communities, quietly became beacons of agricultural innovation. You might even call them the unsung heroes of medieval farming. It was within these hallowed walls that monks pioneered groundbreaking techniques in crop rotation, experimented with ingenious irrigation systems, and developed more efficient animal husbandry practices. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to improve food production, bringing hope to the wider communities. They also served as vital centers of charity, distributing life-saving bread and ale to the hungry, and offering a warm, safe haven for weary travelers and pilgrims passing through. Consider the remarkable story of Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a shining example of the Church's more benevolent relationship with food. Born into a noble German family in the 12th century, Hildegard rose to become an abbess, renowned not only for her spiritual insights, but also for her profound knowledge of herbal medicine and nutrition. Imagine her tending to her garden, her mind sharp and curious. She wrote extensively about the properties of different grains and foods, even advocating for spelt as a healthier, more easily digestible alternative to the common wheat of the day. Under her wise guidance, the nuns at her abbey produced high-quality, nourishing bread, which they distributed generously to the sick and the poor in the surrounding community. Hildegard's holistic approach to nutrition, emphasizing the deep connection between food and health, was remarkably prescient, a wisdom that wouldn't be fully appreciated until many centuries later. Then the darkness truly descended. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 represents perhaps the darkest, most terrifying chapter in medieval food history. Imagine a catastrophic storm brewing, a perfect, deadly confluence of climate change, devastating crop failures, and simmering political instability. This toxic cocktail plunged much of Europe into 7 agonizing years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles, filled with the raw horror of the time, paint a truly harrowing picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people just like you. The Flemish chronicler, William of Nangus, wrote of men driven to eat dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things. Other accounts, even more chilling, describe people resorting to cannibalism in their utter desperation. The famine struck different regions with varying severity. Yes, but nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was entirely spared its brutal touch. In some areas of the Low Countries and Scandinavia, mortality rates soared to a staggering 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt, for instance, witnessed an average of 16 deaths per day during the famine's most brutal depths. Can you even fathom such a daily toll? Years, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Imagine, if you can, the constant gnawing ache in your stomach, not just for a few hours, but for weeks, even months on end. During those truly lean years, when famine stalked the land like a silent predator, you might see mortality rates soar, not just a couple of lives extinguished daily, but an unimaginable torrent of souls lost. The physical toll was gruesome, yes, but the psychological scars etched themselves even deeper onto the very soul of a generation, a silent, enduring testament to the terror of genuine hunger and the profound emptiness of loss. Even when crops were good, a shiver of fear ran through you, a whisper of impending doom. One bad harvest, just one, and suddenly your entire village, your family, stood on the precipice of absolute disaster. Doesn't that just make you clench your teeth? This relentless uncertainty, this tightrope walk with starvation, seeped into every fiber of medieval existence. It dictated who you married, how many children you dared to bring into this precarious world, the very prayers you whispered to the heavens, and the intricate social webs you wove. You learned early on, didn't you, that survival was a communal effort. Elaborate systems of mutual aid sprang up, a vital lifeline in desperate times, alongside an almost instinctual, encyclopedic knowledge of every edible root, berry, or leaf in the forest. You knew precisely where to forage, what might stave off the hunger pangs just a little longer. It's a stark, almost dizzying contrast, isn't it, to our world today? Just pause for a moment, close your eyes, and then open them in the dazzling aisles of a modern supermarket. You see it, don't you? A riot of color, vibrant fruits flown in from sun-drenched South American orchards, aromatic spices from distant Asian lands, crisp vegetables from every corner of the globe. Everything's perfectly packaged, pristine, ready for your basket. This sheer variety, this effortless access to delicacies, would have been utterly beyond the wildest dreams of even the most opulent medieval noble. You'd be utterly bewildered, perhaps even a little overwhelmed by such a spectacle. Our grasp of nutrition, our rigorous standards for food safety, and our sophisticated preservation techniques have utterly transformed eating. For us, it's often a delightful pursuit, a moment of pleasure and deep nourishment, rather than the relentless daily struggle it once was. Yet, isn't it ironic that this very bounty brings its own set of perplexing dilemmas? You find yourself wrestling with mountains of food waste, the complex puzzle of environmental sustainability, and a whole host of diet-related health issues that simply didn't exist in the medieval era. Our sprawling global food network, while offering unparalleled choice, also inadvertently weaves new patterns of inequality and strains our planet's delicate balance. Perhaps there are profound lessons to be learned from our medieval forebears. With their intimate knowledge of local, seasonal rhythms, about true value, and the importance of not taking food for granted. Ultimately, when you peel back the layers, the saga of medieval food isn't just about scarcity. It's a profound testament to sheer human resilience and the dazzling ingenuity that blooms in the face of truly enormous challenges. Despite the ever-present specter of hunger, the ravages of disease, and even the dishonest practice of food adulteration, these ancestors of yours didn't just survive, they carved out moments of genuine joy and heartfelt celebration, often centered right around their meager meals. Think about it. They honed preservation techniques, smoking, salting, pickling methods you still employ in your own kitchen today, shaping what we consider delicious. They crafted dishes that, through countless subtle evolutions, became the very bedrock of our modern cuisines. And they forged enduring traditions of hospitality and sharing that continue to define our culture. When you cast your mind back to this distant, demanding past, doesn't it fill you with a deeper appreciation for the staggering progress we've achieved, the quiet privileges we now simply take for granted? That effortless flick of your wrist to open a refrigerator door, or your casual stroll through a well-stocked grocery aisle. These simple acts embody centuries of groundbreaking advancements in agriculture, technology, and sophisticated social organization. And yet, the medieval struggle echoes a vital truth: our fundamental dependence on food, and the profound, undeniable importance of ensuring everyone, everywhere, has access to the nourishment they need to thrive. You might be surprised to discover just how vividly the legacy of medieval food culture still resonates around you today. Think of those traditional preservation methods, like the smoky scent of cured meats or the tangy bubble of fermented vegetables. They're enjoying a vibrant renaissance among contemporary chefs and home cooks, all searching for authentic flavors and more sustainable ways to eat. Even the ancient, comforting rhythm of seasonal eating, which once strictly governed medieval diets, is now being enthusiastically rediscovered by those championing local, sustainable agriculture. And the lavish, elaborate feasts once enjoyed by the nobility, you can see their modern echoes in the breathtaking artistry of today's fine dining establishments, transforming a meal into a theatrical event. But perhaps the most profound lesson the medieval experience imparts to you is the unbreakable bond between food, community, and the sheer grit of survival. In a world where the gnawing threat of hunger was a constant, unwelcome companion, the simple act of sharing a meal, even a meager one, wasn't just politeness. It became one of the most fundamental, heartfelt expressions of human compassion and deep solidarity. Those communal meals, marking joyous religious festivals or poignant life transitions, weren't merely celebrations. They were potent, palpable affirmations of social bonds, a vital weaving of mutual support that truly held society together. So, as you finally drift into sleep tonight, cocooned in your modern world of seemingly endless abundance, take a moment to recall those countless generations who struggled, day after grueling day, simply to fill their bellies with whatever meager sustenance they could possibly find. Their sheer perseverance in the face of such unrelenting hardship, their quiet defiance of starvation, serves as a powerful testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. Doesn't it make you feel a profound sense of gratitude for the simple, fundamental blessings we so often overlook? By honoring their memory, by understanding their struggles, you, too, commit yourself to building a future where no one ever again has to endure the brutal, defining pangs of hunger that have scarred so much of human history. Now, let's pull you back through time, back to an age where the flickering, nervous glow of candlelight danced long, shifting shadows across the rough-hewn stone walls of medieval castles. Here, you'd immediately perceive a truly stark culinary divide, a chasm separating the haves and have-nots. While the privileged nobles reveled in their exotic delicacies and sprawled across sumptuous banquets, overflowing with rich flavors and rare treats, the vast majority of medieval Europeans faced a daily, desperate struggle for mere sustenance. It was a reality so grim, so relentlessly difficult, that it would frankly horrify your modern sensibilities. You might need a moment to truly adjust to the gravity of it. One of the most immediate, glaring distinctions you'd notice between the tables of the wealthy and the poor in this era was the sheer scarcity and thus astronomical cost of spices. Imagine this: a single pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could set you back the equivalent value of *7 fattened oxen. 7. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? So, while nobles infused their elaborate dishes with a symphony of imported flavors, the common peasant simply had to make do, bravely battling the relentless blandness of their daily fare with whatever meager, locally sourced seasonings they could find. Garlic, potent mustard, and sharp vinegar became their primary, almost heroic, weapons in this culinary fight. Without the reliable preservation methods you take for granted today, fresh produce was a fleeting, seasonal luxury. So, you'd likely spend most of your year subsisting on a monotonous diet of grains, gruel, rough bread, and whatever hardy, root-cellared vegetables could withstand the harsh, unforgiving climate. But perhaps the starkest, most heartbreaking inequality was laid bare on the dinner plate itself: meat consumption. A prosperous peasant family might, if they were truly fortunate, slaughter their pig just once a year, a precious Christmas treat. Meanwhile, the lords and ladies you observed gorged themselves on an endless parade of elaborate, rich dishes featuring exotic game, venison, boar, fowl, a truly different world. And even when meat did miraculously grace a peasant's table, it wasn't the prime cuts you'd imagine. Oh no. You'd likely be served dishes that would, frankly, make your modern stomach churn. Perhaps glistening organ meats, dark, rich blood puddings, or tough cuts from animals too old, too sick, or simply too broken for any other purpose. It was nose-to-tail eating, but out of necessity, not culinary trend. Fish provided a welcome, though often monotonous, reprieve for those living near rivers or the coast. Yet, even this bounty was typically preserved through heavy salting, transforming it into something a far cry from the delicate, flaky preparations you cherish today. The omnipresent influence of the church, you'd quickly realize, permeated every single aspect of medieval food culture, and often, cruelly, compounded the already immense hardships faced by the poor. Consider Lent. Those 40 days of fasting meant you, as a peasant, were expected to give up the already meager scraps of meat and dairy you possessed. Meanwhile, the wealthy nobles could easily afford lavish, exotic substitutes, rare fish, expensive vegetables, truly bypassing the spirit of the fast. Think of Agnes Paston, hauled before a memorial court in 1322 for the desperate act of stealing bread during Lent, all to feed her own starving children. Doesn't that just illustrate the utterly cruel irony of imposing stringent religious dietary restrictions on those already teetering on the very edge of starvation? It's a gut-wrenching thought. And as if hunger wasn't enough, you also had to contend with the pervasive scourge of food adulteration, running rampant in an age utterly devoid of modern regulations or quality control. Imagine walking into a baker's shop, the aroma of fresh bread, a tempting deception. Unscrupulous bakers, driven by greed and the scarcity of ingredients, would routinely stretch their precious flour with, well, less appetizing fillers. Think sawdust, chalk, or even ground acorns, all mixed in. The result, dense, gritty loaves that sat heavy in your stomach, but offered precious little actual nutrition. You'd taste the deception, wouldn't you? Similarly, the alewives, those who brewed your daily pint, were notorious for watering down their brews to maximize their meager profits. You'd be handed a weak, insipid drink, barely qualifying as a beverage, leaving you feeling cheated and unsatisfied. This systemic dishonesty was so widespread, so ingrained, that authorities eventually had to step in. Laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale were established, a desperate attempt to bring some semblance of order and fairness to the marketplace, to regulate these ... A medieval mind, you see. To them, the very notion of everyone standing equal before the law, regardless of birthright or station, would have been as absurd as suggesting a peasant could dine nightly on roasted peacock. After all, wasn't society ordained by God? Kings ruled by divine right, nobles inherited their lands and status, and the peasant was born to the soil. Justice, therefore, wasn't about abstract fairness. It was about maintaining that sacred order, about ensuring everyone knew their place. You might find yourself stifling a gasp, perhaps a shiver tracing your spine, as you realize just how fundamentally different their worldview was from our own. There was no innocent until proven guilty in the way we understand it today. Instead, you often faced a world where your standing in life weighed heavily on your fate. So, if true legal equality was a foreign concept, how did they determine guilt or innocence in an age without forensics or even reliable witness testimony? Often, they turned to God Himself for a judgment, believing the divine would intervene to reveal the truth. This brings us to the infamous trials by ordeal, a concept that feels both ancient and chillingly personal. Imagine you're the accused, standing on the cold, damp stone floor of a manor house, the heavy scent of wood smoke and fear thick in the air. Your fate rests not on a jury, but perhaps on the ability to plunge your arm into boiling water, or grasp a searing hot iron and emerge unscathed days later. The air hangs heavy, every breath a prayer. Or perhaps you'd be subjected to the ordeal of cold water, bound and thrown into a murky pond or river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, tragically, usually to your death, you were considered innocent. Isn't that just a delightful paradox? The Church, with its immense spiritual authority, often sanctioned these ordeals, lending them an aura of divine infallibility. Priests would bless the implements, offer prayers, and interpret the outcome, solidifying the belief that God was indeed speaking through the burn, the float, or the sink. It's a stark reminder that faith, in those times, was not merely a personal conviction, but a formidable force shaping every aspect of law and life, holding an entire society in its grip. And then there was trial by combat, a dramatic, visceral spectacle reserved primarily for disputes between nobles or cases where a man of lower standing challenged his accuser. Picture the scene. Two opponents, perhaps clad in chainmail, standing in a dusty field, the clang of steel echoing under a gray sky as a hushed crowd watches their struggle. It wasn't about skill in battle as much as it was about divine favor, the belief that God would grant victory to the righteous party. You can almost feel the tension, the sheer adrenaline, as these men fought not just for their lives, but for their honor and the very truth of their claims. Let's be honest, it makes modern courtrooms feel a tad pedestrian, doesn't it? Though certainly safer. These were the realities, the everyday terrors and spectacles of medieval justice, a system where the scales were rarely balanced. Your standing in society was often your shield or your sword. A noble might face a trial by combat, risking his life but maintaining his honor, while a peasant accused of a similar crime might be swiftly condemned to a public whipping, mutilation, or even the gallows, his cries lost to the wind. The subtle currents of power, wealth, and social connections flowed beneath every judgment, shaping destinies with an invisible yet iron hand. There was no single unifying legal code, remember, but a mosaic of local customs, feudal obligations, and church decrees, making justice a truly unpredictable beast. You stand in the shadowed hall of a medieval lord, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a stark reminder of the social chasm that yawned between the powerful and the powerless. Asterisk, let's be honest. Asterisk, you'd quickly realize, watching the flickering torchlight dance across the tapestries, the very fabric of this society was woven with threads of deep inequality. He, the Lord, saw himself as inherently superior, a creature of a finer mold, while the peasants tilling his fields were little more than tools in his grand design. The law, you quickly learned, wasn't some grand equalizer. Oh no, it was a finely crafted instrument, honed to serve the interests of men like him, the ruling class, through and through. Any crumbs of benefit that might fall to the common folk, purely accidental, my friend, the merest happenstance. And nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did this stark, brutal imbalance shine brighter than in the cold, unforgiving light of criminal justice. Imagine the scene, a crime committed, perhaps a muffled cry in the night, a stolen pig, or a hushed accusation, the response of the authorities. It was never straightforward. It hinged entirely, you see, on who stood before the judgment, the social status of the perpetrator, and, just as crucially, the victim. A peasant, driven by hunger, perhaps, snatches a meager loaf from a nobleman's sprawling table, the aroma of fresh bread, a cruel temptress. His fate, a hangman's noose, might await, or worse, the glint of a blade poised for mutilation, a lifetime of shame etched onto his body. A chilling thought, isn't it? But then, picture this: a nobleman, in a sudden, drunken fit of pique, perhaps, or a moment of pure Septa's unbridled rage, strikes down a peasant. The peasant falls, lifeless, on the muddy ground, the silence around him sudden and profound. What then? Does the gallows beckon for the Lord? Hardly. He might, with a casual wave of his hand, settle the matter with a mere payment to the grieving family, a sum far less than the cost of his annual feast. The wealthy, you quickly discovered, had an uncanny knack for navigating these troubled legal waters. They could, and often did, purchase their freedom. Bribes, whispered connections in high places, or that ever so clever loophole, the benefit of clergy. Ah, the magic of literacy. If you could recite a few lines of Latin, you were whisked away to an ecclesiastical court, where the punishments, bless their pious hearts, were almost always a gentle breeze compared to the raging storm of secular law. Quite the system, wouldn't you agree? Stepping further into this world, you'd find that the very process of determining guilt or innocence bore little resemblance to any modern notion of justice. Forget forensic evidence. Forget meticulous cross-examination. Those were concepts centuries away. Here, in the dim light of medieval courts, proof, as we understand it, was rarely considered the decisive factor. Instead, the entire system leaned heavily on the unseen, on supernatural intervention and the direct judgment of a divine power to unveil the truth. It was a profoundly spiritual approach to law, born from an unshakable belief that God would never permit an innocent soul to suffer unjustly. This conviction, noble in its intent perhaps, gave rise to some of the most bizarre and brutal legal practices imaginable. Procedures that, to your modern mind, seem utterly incomprehensible, yet were accepted as perfectly reasonable by the people of this age. One such practice, steeped in that faith, was the harrowing trial by ordeal. It was predicated on the simple, terrifying assumption that divine intervention would protect the innocent, while simultaneously laying bare the guilt of the wicked. You might think, surely there can't be many ways to test this, but oh, there were several forms, each more agonizing than the last, designed to push human endurance to its absolute limits, all while watching for a sign from heaven. Imagine the fear, the cold dread creeping into your bones, knowing your fate rested not on logic or testimony, but on a searing touch or a chilling plunge. Let's consider the ordeal of hot iron. You'd be led before the community, the heavy gaze of everyone upon you, perhaps a dull, metallic temps filling the air. There, a piece of metal, glowing cherry red from the forge, would be presented. You'd be forced to carry this searing object for a prescribed distance, often 9 agonizing paces. The smell of scorched flesh, though faint, would surely haunt your nostrils. Afterward, your seared hand would be tightly bandaged, and then you would wait for 3 excruciating days for judgment. If the wound, when finally unwrapped, showed clean healing, free from infection, you were declared innocent, accepted by God. But if it festered, oozed with pus, or showed any sign of disease, then you were undeniably guilty, and the punishment, often severe, would follow. Similarly, there was the ordeal of hot water. Here, the challenge was different, but no less terrifying. You would be required to plunge your bare hand into a cauldron of boiling water, steam rising in a suffocating cloud around you, to retrieve a small stone or ring from its depths. The scalding pain would be instant, searing, and just like with the hot iron, your fate hung in the balance for 3 agonizing days as the wound was monitored. A clean recovery meant innocence, But infection signaled guilt. The raw, throbbing pain, the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety of divine scrutiny was an unimaginable burden. For those accused of particularly heinous crimes, there was an even more chilling test, the ordeal of cold water, which operated on a completely opposite, yet equally grim, principle. You would be bound, hands and feet tightly secured, and then cast into a body of water, typically a pond or a river, perhaps one blessed by a local priest, its surface shimmering under the watchful eyes of the crowd. The immediate shock of the icy water, the desperate struggle against the ropes, the panic as your lungs screamed for air. If you sank beneath the surface, your body drawn down into the pure depths, you were considered innocent. The sacred water, they believed, had accepted your uncorrupted soul. But if you floated, rejected by the pure element, deemed an unnatural aberration, you were judged guilty, your soul corrupted. Either way, you faced a truly grim prospect, drowning if innocent, or surviving only to face execution if guilty. A lose-lose situation, if there ever was one, powered by the medieval belief that pure water would naturally reject anything evil. These ordeals were not casual affairs, mind you. Oh no, they were elaborate, solemn rituals, often taking place within the consecrated walls of a church or some other sacred space. The air would be thick with the scent of incense, the low murmur of prayers, and the hushed anticipation of the gathered community. Priests, robed in their vestments, would preside over the proceedings, blessing the instruments of trial, the iron, the water, the very ropes that bound the accused. You yourself would be required to fast for several days beforehand, the gnawing hunger a constant companion, and to attend special masses, all designed to purify your soul before facing God's ultimate judgment. The entire community would gather, watching with bated breath, witnessing not only a means of determining guilt, but a powerful public demonstration of divine power and earthly authority. It was truly a spectacle. The psychological impact of these ordeals, you can well imagine, was utterly immense. Many accused individuals, truly believing themselves guilty, or simply convinced that God, in his infinite wisdom, would inevitably reveal their sins, would confess their crimes before ever stepping up to the searing iron or the boiling cauldron. Others, seized by a raw, primal terror at the prospect of such divine judgment, would simply flee before the appointed day. And that act of flight, you see, was immediately taken as unequivocal evidence of their guilt. In some cases, the mere terrifying threat of a trial by ordeal was enough to extract a confession or to resolve a simmering dispute without any need for the actual horrific procedure. Just the idea of it was enough to break a man. But perhaps even more telling about medieval attitudes toward justice, offering a glimpse into their understanding of divine will and human strength, was the practice of trial by combat. Here, disputes, often deeply personal and significant, were resolved not through hot iron or boiling water, but through the brutal, direct clash of armed conflict between the parties involved. This was based on the profound belief that God, being just, would grant victory to the party in the right, thereby ensuring that justice would prevail, literally, through strength of arms. Can you imagine settling your arguments with a sword? Trial by combat could be invoked for an incredibly wide range of disputes, from grave accusations of treason and murder, the scent of fear thick in the air, to more mundane disagreements over property rights, or even sticky commercial contracts. The combatants, in a fascinating display of social stratification, would fight with weapons appropriate to their social status. Nobles, perhaps, would enter the designated arena with gleaming swords and sturdy shields, their armor clanking with every movement. Commoners, by contrast, might be armed with simpler clubs or sturdy staffs, the dull thud of wood on wood their only hope. The rules governing trial by combat, surprisingly, were quite elaborate and formal. The fight would take place in a specifically designated area, often a dusty field just outside the town walls, beneath the harsh sun, with strict boundaries clearly marked to prevent either combatant from fleeing. Officials would oversee the entire proceedings, their faces grim, ensuring that the combat was conducted fairly, though what exactly constituted fairness in a system based on mortal combat is, let's be honest, a rather questionable concept. The fight itself would continue, a brutal ballet of blows and parries, until one party was either killed outright, severely wounded and incapacitated, or surrendered by crying out for mercy, their voice raw with pain and defeat. Victory was taken as clear, undeniable evidence of divine favor, and thus of the righteousness of the winner's cause. And what if you couldn't fight for yourself? Perhaps you were too old, or disabled, or a woman. Well, the system, in its own unique way, made a provision for that. You could appoint a champion who would fight on your behalf, stepping into the dusty arena to face your accuser. This fascinating loophole gave rise to an entire class of professional fighters, skilled warriors, who made their living by serving as champions in these legal disputes. These men, often formidable figures, would fight for whoever could afford their services, a stark reminder of the ever-present influence of wealth, often regardless of the actual merits of the case. The wealthy could hire the best, most seasoned champions, their reputations preceding them like a storm cloud, while the poor were left to find whatever representation they could afford, or face a champion far beyond their means. Imagine yourself in a world where physical strength often decided your fate, where the clang of steel wasn't just warfare, but sometimes the very sound of justice. For you, as a woman in this era, the path to legal recourse was, let's be honest, incredibly steep. If an accusation arose, how could you possibly contend with a burly opponent when battle was simply not your realm? You might appoint a male champion, a hired sword, to fight on your behalf, but then you're at the mercy of his loyalty, his skill, his commitment to your cause. Could you truly trust your life to another man's blade? And sometimes, in rare, grim instances, you might be allowed to fight your male accuser directly. But don't imagine a fair contest, not even for a second. Picture this. You're standing in a deep pit, perhaps up to your waist, the damp earth clinging to your garments, one arm bound tightly behind your back, useless. Above you, your accuser, free to move, fully armed, perhaps with a menacing glint in his eye. The air is thick with anticipation, the hushed gasps of the onlookers. It's hardly a level playing field, is it? More like a cruel theater designed to confirm a predetermined outcome. This stark brutality, you see, wasn't confined to the dueling ground. Oh no. The echo of its harsh logic resonated far beyond the courtrooms, bleeding into the very punishments meted out to the guilty. Medieval justice, you'll quickly realize, wasn't about redemption or a second chance. It was a cold, hard ledger of retribution. Punishments weren't just severe. They were grand, public spectacles, designed to etch a terrifying lesson into the collective memory of the populace. Every crack of the whip, every severed limb, was a stark, visceral warning. Cross the line, and this awaits you. The creativity of their cruelty was, frankly, astonishing. This society saw physical suffering as the perfect antidote to moral failings. Take theft, for instance, a tragically common crime in a world where poverty gnawed at everyone's heels like a hungry dog. The consequences, they depended entirely on what you took and who you were. A desperate peasant caught pilfering a loaf of bread might lose the very hand that snatched it. Imagine the searing pain, the stench of cauterized flesh, and then the slow, agonizing realization that you've been condemned to starve, unable to work. A repeat offender, you'd be dangling from the gallows, twisting slowly in the breeze, a macabre scarecrow, but dared to steal from the sanctity of a church, and the severity escalated dramatically. Perhaps your eyes would be gouged out, plunging you into an eternal, terrifying darkness, or your tongue ripped from your mouth, silencing you forever. The logic, twisted as it seems to our modern sensibilities, was chillingly simple. The punishment mirrored the crime. The hand that stole, the tongue that lied, each a direct consequence. Public executions weren't merely legal necessities. They were elaborate theatrical productions, drawing crowds from villages miles away. Imagine the carnival atmosphere, the murmuring throng, the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies, punctuated by the metallic temps of fear. It was entertainment, yes, but also a grim moral lecture, a stark object lesson for all to see. You'd watch the condemned paraded through cobblestone streets, their faces often pale with terror, flanked by solemn priests urging final confessions, preparing them for the journey to the afterlife. The chosen method of execution itself was a statement, a reflection of both the crime's gravity and your place in the social pecking order. If you were a noble, a flash of the axe might grant you the swift, honorable finality of beheading, a sharp thud, a quick end. But for the common folk, it was usually the gallows. A slower, more degrading demise, certainly, but equally conclusive. The creak of the rope, the sudden drop, the gasps of the crowd, an unforgettable, brutal spectacle. For crimes deemed truly heinous, however, medieval justice escalated far beyond a simple death. Traitors, for example, faced a horror you can barely conceive, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Feel the rough hurdle dragging you over uneven stones, the pain of the journey through jeering crowds. Then the sickening sensation of the rope tightening around your throat, the world blurring as you near death, only to be cut down. Then, while still agonizingly alive, your entrails pulled from your body. Finally, your corpse dismembered, pieces sent to adorn city gates, a grisly warning for all who dared defy the crown. Heretics and those accused of witchcraft faced another terrifying end, the stake. Imagine the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh, the searing heat, as fire was believed to purify the soul. A dramatic demonstration of divine wrath for those who challenged religious authority. Women, too, faced specific, gendered punishments that highlighted societal biases. If you, as a woman, murdered your husband, the natural order was seen as so fundamentally betrayed that you might be burned alive, a punishment mirroring treason. Lesser transgressions brought different forms of public shaming. Prostitutes might be forced to wear distinctive, garish clothing, an outward mark of their perceived sin, or have their heads brutally shaved, a public humiliation. And if you were deemed a scold or a shrew, a woman too loud, too opinionated, too ... unfeminine, perhaps, you might find yourself strapped to the ducking stool. Picture the cold shock of river water, again and again, as you're repeatedly plunged beneath the surface until you promised to mend your ways. Isn't that just like history? finding new ways to control. Yet, for all this brutal enforcement, the application of justice was far from consistent. Power, as it always does, found its loopholes. If you were wealthy or well-connected, you often had an escape hatch. The benefit of clergy, for instance, allowed anyone who could read even a single line of scripture to claim trial in a church court, where punishments were usually far less severe. A quick recitation of a psalm could literally save your skin. Then there were sanctuary laws. If you could make it to the hallowed ground of a church, you were temporarily safe from secular authorities, given a breathing space, a chance to negotiate or escape. The wealthy, of course, could often simply pay their way out, offering compositions, monetary payments, instead of physical suffering. Or, if all else failed, you could simply flee, melt away into another jurisdiction, where your crime was unknown, your face unrecognized, a clean slate, or so you hoped. This system, for all its cruelty and arbitrary nature, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It served several crucial functions in medieval society. Public punishments were potent displays, reinforcing the strict social hierarchies, a stark reminder of who held the power and what happened when you dared to challenge it. Imagine the chilling message it sent to a vast, restive population. And let's not forget, in a world starved for entertainment, these grim spectacles were a macabre form of diversion. A day out, perhaps, to witness a hanging. But most importantly, these brutal displays fostered a pervasive climate of fear. This fear was the invisible hand that maintained control over a populace that vastly outnumbered their rulers, a population that, frankly, had very little to lose by choosing rebellion. Fear kept them in line. Beyond the sheer brutality, the legal landscape itself was a bewildering maze, a direct reflection of Europe's fragmented political authority. Imagine yourself as a traveler, moving from one feudal lord's domain to another. One day, you might be under one set of rules, the next, an entirely different code. The air shifted, the customs changed, creating a bewildering patchwork of laws and traditions that could easily trip you up. You'd navigate through layers of legal thought. There was canon law, born from church teachings and papal decrees, governing your marriage, your morality, your religious duties. Then Roman law, a powerful echo from the ancient empire, which subtly influenced legal systems across much of the continent. And, of course, the ancient Germanic tribal laws, passed down through generations, slowly codified, dictating many aspects of your daily life in regions settled by those very tribes. And layered on top of all this were the countless local customs and traditions, adding yet another twist to this legal labyrinth. What was considered a perfectly acceptable practice in one village might land you in serious trouble just a few miles down the road. Property rights, marriage rituals, how you conducted your trade, everything could vary wildly from place to place. For a merchant traveling from town to town, this was a constant tightrope walk. You had to be intimately familiar with every local quirk, every hidden rule, because, let's be honest, ignorance was rarely, if ever, an acceptable excuse for transgression. The stakes were simply too high. The church played a particularly important role. Imagine you're standing in a quiet, dust-filled chamber, perhaps a scriptorium, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill on vellum. This is where the church asserted its profound influence, not just through its own intricate canon law, those ancient rules laid down by spiritual decree, but by subtly guiding the very hand of secular justice. Its educated clerks, Men whose sharp minds could actually decipher the sprawling, often beautiful, script of legal documents became indispensable to lords and kings alike. Without them, who would write the sentences? Who would record the pleas? Think for a moment about the kind of society this created. A world where the lines between spiritual transgression and criminal offense were blurred, almost non-existent. You see, so many of the laws woven into the very fabric of medieval life were explicitly crafted to uphold Christian morality and to reinforce the absolute, unquestionable authority of the Church. Utter a single blasphemous word, stray even slightly into what was deemed heresy, or simply neglect to show your face at Mass on a holy day, and poof, you'd find yourself facing punishments so grim they might chill you to the bone. Isn't that a terrifying thought? And let's not forget the sheer magnitude of the Church's power, shall we? With vast estates stretching across the land, its coffers overflowing. It was a colossal economic and political force, rivaling even kings. This meant that its own ecclesiastical courts, those hallowed halls of spiritual judgment, claimed dominion over disputes that in your modern world would be considered entirely secular. A land dispute, a contested inheritance. Chances are you'd find yourself standing before a robed cleric rather than a king's magistrate. As you peer back into these harsh realities of medieval justice, a stark truth emerges, doesn't it? The very foundations of law were built upon vastly different ideas about what it meant to be human, about God's will, and about the natural order of society. Forget everything you know about fairness, about the concept that justice should be impartial, a blindfolded figure weighing scales. Forget the notion that punishment ought to precisely fit the crime, or that everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, stands truly equal before the law. These were utterly alien concepts, almost unimaginable in a time when the rigid structure of society, the king, the lords, the serfs, was viewed as nothing less than divinely ordained. Here, the law's prime directive wasn't to safeguard your individual rights, but to simply keep order, to prevent the whole intricate, fragile system from unraveling. A heavy hand, indeed. Yet, as brutal as it all sounds, a surprising echo of these medieval legal systems still resonates in your world today. Think of the adversarial dance in a courtroom, the opposing sides battling it out, or the very idea of a jury, ordinary folks gathered to decide someone's fate. It's all a long, winding thread stretching back to these ancient practices. But make no mistake, the path from that harsh, arbitrary justice, where decisions often felt plucked from thin air, to the more humane, rational systems you cherish now, has been agonizingly slow. It was a journey paved with the silent struggles of countless generations, each striving for reform, each yearning for a glimmer of human dignity. A long, hard road, wouldn't you agree? Now, as the ambient light around you softens, and a gentle stillness settles, let these vivid images of medieval justice begin to recede, dissolving into the edges of your awareness. Allow the sounds of ancient courts to quiet, the stern faces of judges to blur. For a moment, just feel the weighty truth of a time when might truly made right, when divine judgment was sought through terrifying trials by fire, or the frigid grasp of water, and public executions were spectacles, chilling performances meant to both entertain and instill a stark moral lesson. These, believe it or not, were the rough, uncompromising foundations upon which your modern world was painstakingly built. Imagine it as dark, unforgiving soil, tilled by suffering and struggle, from which eventually, against all odds, sprouted the radical, precious ideas of human rights, the the sanctity of due process, and the principle of equal justice under the law concepts you now, perhaps too easily, take for granted. Without that dark soil, would these ideas ever have taken root? So, rest easy, knowing that while the struggles of your medieval ancestors were undeniably real, their lives often brutally short and harsh, they weren't in vain. Their profound suffering laid the crucial groundwork for the more just and humane societies you inhabit today. It was a hard-won, often bloody, education for humanity, teaching invaluable lessons about the importance of fairness, the necessity of compassion, and the fundamental power of the rule of law. And in their quiet stories of endurance, in the face of such arbitrary power and cruel justice, you can find a profound inspiration for your own ongoing efforts. They remind you that the quest for a world where all people can live with dignity, where hope is a tangible presence, is a timeless one. Their whispers echo across the centuries, urging you onward. For even as these grand legal philosophies were taking shape, for good or ill, the daily reality for most people was far more immediate, far more visceral. Let's journey now, far from the grand courts and learned clerks, and instead step onto the damp, windswept earth of medieval Scotland, where a different kind of struggle defined every waking moment. Here, life for a peasant like Hamish Mallowd, a humble cotter in the rugged Scottish Highlands, was a relentless duel. He wrestled not only with the heavy hand of human oppression, the clan warfare that roared across the hills, the devastating incursions of English armies, but also with the merciless, unyielding forces of nature itself. These were his daily battles, seemingly mundane, yet no less dire than any grand skirmish. His small strip of land, grudgingly carved from his clan chief's vast estates, demanded every ounce of his strength, every drop of his sweat. Imagine the first stirrings of dawn, a gray chill still clinging to the air, long before the sun even thought about cresting the eastern peaks. You hear the deep, resonant scrape of stone against stone, a sound that defines their early mornings. That's Hamish's wife, Margaret, patiently grinding oats, the rhythmic whisper of her labor, a constant soundtrack to their fragile existence. Their one-room dwelling, shared not just by his family, but also a cow and a few chickens, whose warmth was desperately needed, felt perpetually damp. The highland mists, cold and thick, seemed to seep through every crevice in the rough-hewn stone walls, a constant, chilling embrace. The very earth Hamish worked was a challenge, thin, stony, a miserly patch that reluctantly surrendered meager crops of oats and barley. These precious grains, once harvested, formed the very backbone of their sparse diet. A truly fortunate year, blessed with good weather and hard work, might see his family scrape through the brutal winter months, but a poor harvest that meant the agonizing, slow horror of watching his children's small faces grow gaunt, their ribs more prominent with each passing day as the family stores dwindled to nothing. The chilling specter of famine was never far, a constant shadow in every peasant's mind. When famine inevitably descended, as it often did, entire communities could be reduced to desperate measures, scavenging for grass, stripping bark from trees, or digging for whatever meager roots they could pry from the frozen, unforgiving ground. Even during times of relative abundance, the quality of food for people like Hamish was, by your standards, woefully poor. Their bread, a staple, was often baked from inferior grains, stretched with whatever fillers could be scrounged, ground acorns, dried peas, or, in truly desperate times, even sawdust. The loaves that resulted were dense, gritty affairs, so rough they could actually chip a tooth, and providing surprisingly little real nourishment. Meat that was a rare, almost mythical luxury, perhaps a small piece of salted pork to mark Christmas, or a sudden unexpected feast if an animal succumbed to natural causes. Beyond the scarcity, the very act of preparing and storing food presented a relentless gauntlet of challenges in an age utterly devoid of refrigeration or effective preservation techniques. Imagine trying to keep grains safe from the gnawing teeth of rats and the insidious damp that turned everything to mold, with storage facilities that were, at best, primitive holes or rickety sheds. Milk, freshly drawn and warm, would curdle and sour with alarming speed. Meat, without the benefit of ice or salt, would spoil rapidly in anything but the coldest weather. Even ale, their common beverage of choice, because clean water was so often a dangerous rarity, could turn rancid if not consumed quickly. And the very act of eating, something you take for granted as safe and nourishing, was fraught with unseen perils, dangers almost unimaginable in your clean, modern kitchens. Contamination was rampant, an accepted part of life. You'd find livestock sharing the same cramped spaces where meals were prepared and consumed. Flies, buzzing ceaselessly, would flit between animal waste and open cooking pots. Vermin, the scuttling unseen residents, would dart through grain stores and kitchen nooks. Food poisoning, therefore, was a common, brutal reality, and it spared no one, not even the highborn. Indeed, even a king, John of England himself, famously met his end in 1216 after indulging in what were likely spoiled peaches. As if these daily struggles weren't enough, consider the further restrictions imposed by the omnipresent Catholic Church during Lent and other designated fast days throughout the year. For families like Hamish's, already teetering on the precipice of starvation, even the meager sources of protein they occasionally managed to acquire were strictly forbidden. These additional dietary constraints often pushed them beyond the brink into outright famine. You can almost feel the crushing helplessness of Margaret Mallowd, watching her children grow visibly weaker over the 40 long days of Lent, knowing their few precious eggs and strips of dried fish, vital for survival, had to be put aside, sacrificed to the unyielding letter of church law, a gut-trenching sacrifice. And if hunger and religious observance weren't enough, there was another insidious layer of misery: the unscrupulous practices of food producers themselves. Imagine a world where the very bakers, those entrusted with providing the most basic sustenance, routinely adulterated their bread. They would stretch their precious flour by mixing in sawdust, chalk, or even ground bones, anything to bulk up their loaves and maximize their profit, regardless of the cost to your health, their meager supplies. Imagine, if you will, the desperate ingenuity of those alewives, stretching their precious brews thin, watering them down just to eke out a few more pennies of profit. You'd receive a weak, watery drink, hardly satisfying, and certainly offering none of the much-needed calories or nutrition your body craved after a long day in the fields. Laws did exist to prevent such blatant swindling, but let's be honest, enforcement was a fickle beast, often as unreliable as the weather itself. This constant, nagging fear of not enough, of not quite getting what you paid for, gnawed at the edges of daily life. Yet, perhaps the most stomach-churning reality of medieval Scottish society was the sheer, brutal chasm of inequality. While you, as a peasant, like Hamish or Margaret, might scrape together a meal of thin, grey porridge and bread so stale it could break a tooth, the great halls of your clan chiefs would be positively groaning under the weight of elaborate feasts. Picture the scene, the rich, smoky aroma of roasted meats turning slowly over an open fire, mingling with the exotic scent of spices brought from distant lands, wafting through the cool, damp air. You'd see tables laden with fine wines, delicate pastries, and a bounty of food that a peasant family couldn't even dream of consuming in an entire month. This wasn't just about the amount of food, was it? No, it was about the very essence of it. Your coarse, monotonous diet of oats and root vegetables left you constantly hungry, vulnerable to every passing sickness that swept through the village. Meanwhile, the wealthy indulged in rich proteins, healthy fats, and those coveted spices, a mere pinch of cinnamon or cloves, for instance, might be worth more than your entire annual income. Such culinary treasures transformed simple ingredients into true delights, a sensory experience you could only imagine. The sheer injustice of it all hangs heavy in the air, a constant, bitter taste. The psychological burden of this perpetual food insecurity is almost impossible to grasp. Think about it. Waking up each morning, the gnawing worry in your gut, never truly knowing where your next meal would come from. A failed harvest, a sudden clan raid, even just a prolonged downpour could plunge your family into outright starvation. This wasn't merely stress, it was a deep, pervasive anxiety that seeped into every thought, every decision. Parents would voluntarily go to bed with empty stomachs, their own hunger a sacrifice for their children, only to watch helplessly as malnutrition stunted their little ones' growth, leaving them frail and susceptible to any disease that dared to pass through the muddy track outside their hovel. But even in the face of such profound hardship, the human spirit, a remarkable thing, somehow endured. You'd witness women like Margaret Mallowd, with calloused hands and a keen mind, developing incredible ingenuity. They learned to identify edible wild plants that flourished in the glens, preserving what little meat came their way through the ancient arts of salting and smoking. The scent of the brine and wood smoke, a familiar comfort. They stretched meager supplies through careful rationing and clever cooking, making something out of seemingly nothing. Community bonds, forged in the crucible of shared adversity, grew remarkably strong. Neighbors helped neighbors through the leanest times, and when a stroke of luck graced someone, they'd all celebrate together, a rare burst of warmth in the cold, hard world. The rhythmic pulse of agricultural life, though demanding, offered a crucial structure, a sliver of hope amid the relentless uncertainty. The crisp arrival of spring, with its faint promise of new growth in the damp soil, carried a quiet optimism. And then the harvest season, heavy with the scent of ripe grain and earth, brought the exhilarating possibility of temporary abundance, even if fleeting. Even the humblest peasant, despite the endless back-breaking labor, could find genuine satisfaction, a small spark of pride in a well-tended garden, or a perfectly brewed batch of ale. These simple, hard-won moments of accomplishment were truly precious. As we cast our minds back to the struggles of medieval Scottish peasants, to the daily lives of Hamish and Margaret Mallowd, you can't help but reflect on how far we, as humanity, have journeyed in securing our most basic needs. The sheer abundance and incredible variety of food available to you today, the stringent safety standards that shield us from contamination, and the social safety nets that offer support in times of crisis, all these represent centuries of slow, often painful improvement. These are the precious legacies born from those dark days when a truly full belly was an unimaginable luxury and hunger a constant, unwelcome companion. Their story, isn't it just like history? It serves as both a stark, sobering echo of the hardships our ancestors faced and a powerful testament to the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. In their persistent, daily struggles for sheer survival, we see something profound: the fundamental dignity of ordinary people. Despite possessing so little, they continually found ways to weave meaning into their lives, to forge deep communities, and to keep the flickering flame of hope alive. The world they inhabited was carved by these very struggles, shaping the social divides we're about to explore. You've seen the harsh realities unfold before you, from the brutal precision of the justice system to the constant, gnawing fight for enough food. These incessant hardships weren't just random acts of misfortune. They were the very tools that carved deep, unyielding divisions into the fragile fabric of society. Those strange laws we've peeked into weren't merely curious quirks of a bygone era. Oh no. They were meticulously crafted instruments designed to reinforce a rigid hierarchy. In this world, the accident of your birth determined your entire destiny with a merciless, almost cruel precision. Can you truly picture it? A world where emerging from one particular womb meant a lifetime of back-breaking labor, while another, born into a different family, guaranteed a life of effortless leisure and overflowing abundance. This was the stark, undeniable reality of medieval Europe. Society was rigidly stratified into what they called 3 distinct orders, each as separate and unmixable as oil and water, yet bound together by invisible, unbreakable chains of obligation and dependence. Right at the very top, piercing the sky like a stone monument to sheer power, sat the nobility, those who fought, those who ruled. These were the lords and ladies you'd find within the cold, echoing walls of their massive castles. Their days were a tapestry of courtly pursuits, elaborate ceremonies, and the intricate, often deadly dance of politics and power. You'd see them draped in silk and velvet, their tables groaning under exotic delicacies, their voices refined, their words carrying weight. For them, the peculiar laws we've discussed were merely tools, sharpened weapons wielded to control those who toiled beneath them. A step below, yet still soaring high above the common masses, stood the clergy, those who prayed. These men and women of God wielded a different, ethereal kind of power, one that claimed dominion not over bodies, but over immortal souls. They lived within the hushed sanctity of monasteries and the soaring majesty of cathedrals, surrounded by the gilded pages of illuminated manuscripts and the revered presence of sacred relics. Their influence, like an invisible tide, stretched into every conceivable corner of life, from the most intimate bedroom confession to the bustling marketplace, dictating not only what people believed, but how they lived, what they ate, and even how they dared to think. And there, at the very base of this colossal structure, supporting the crushing weight of the entire edifice on their perpetually bent backs, toiled the peasantry, those who worked. This vast majority of Europe's population was tethered to the land, rooted as firmly as the ancient oak trees, unable to shift or improve their station without explicit permission from their betters. They lived in humble hovels constructed of mud and thatch, their hands eternally stained with the earth, their backs permanently stained with the earth, their backs permanently curved through the lane with unrain. The legal system, in its ruthless efficiency, was exquisitely designed to maintain these very divisions. Justice itself was a mutable concept, changing dramatically depending on which rung of that merciless ladder you happened to occupy. A noble who, perhaps in a moment